The HOA that weaponized security cameras. The cameras went up the way these things always do, wrapped in good intentions and just enough fear to make people nod along. There had been a few minor incidents in the neighborhood, packages disappearing from porches, a car or two being rummaged through overnight. Nothing major, nothing that couldn't have been handled with a little more awareness. But it was enough. Enough for the HOA to call a meeting. Enough to introduce a solution that sounded reasonable on its face. Community-wide security enhancements, the president called it. Standing at the front of the room, like he was unveiling something, generous instead of something invasive. They presented it well. Cameras at the entrances, along the walking paths, around the clubhouse and shared spaces. A visible deterrent. A safer neighborhood. Most people agreed without much resistance. It felt like a natural step forward. They even brought in a vendor to explain the system. He was local, polished, and practiced. Clearly someone who had given this presentation many times before. He spoke about integration, about cloud storage, about convenience. Everything could be accessed through a single app. Everything could be monitored seamlessly. Public areas are HOA controlled, he explained. Private residences can opt in if they'd like full coverage. Optional. That word did a lot of work in that room. I didn't opt in. I already had my own system, one I installed myself, one that stayed under my control. It covered what I needed and nothing more. But plenty of people signed up, drawn in by the discount the HOA had negotiated and the promise of simplicity. One system, one interface, one solution. At first, it seemed to work. The petty thefts stopped. People felt more comfortable. There was a sense that something had been fixed. Then the violation notices started. At first, they were ordinary enough. Trash bins left out too long. Cars parked incorrectly. The usual things HOAs tend to care about more than they should. But it didn't take long for something to feel off. The notices referenced moments that didn't make sense. Things that happened late at night. Things that weren't visible from the street. Things that shouldn't have been visible at all. One neighbor was cited for how he stored items in his garage. The problem was that his garage door had been closed at the time. Another received a notice about a guest parking violation at 2 a.m. on his own driveway. Someone else was fined for clutter inside. Their home that could only have been seen from within. People started talking. Quietly at first, then with growing concern. The question wasn't complicated. How did they know? The answer came from someone who didn't like loose ends. One of the residents, someone with a technical background, started digging into the system. He checked permissions, looked at access logs, traced how everything connected. When that wasn't enough, he went straight to the source and called the vendor. At first, the answers were smooth and rehearsed. The HOA only had access to public cameras. Private systems were secure. Everything was user-controlled. But under enough pressure, the story began to shift. The vendor mentioned something in passing, an upgraded package, a premium tier. He didn't elaborate, but he didn't need to. It was enough to keep pulling. And when the truth finally came out, it landed harder than anyone expected. The HOA hadn't just installed cameras in shared spaces. They had paid for expanded access, something beyond what had been presented to residents. A higher-tier system that allowed administrative viewing across the entire network, including cameras inside, private homes that had been installed through their vendor. They didn't call it access, but that's exactly what it was. They could see into living rooms, into kitchens, into garages, anywhere a camera had been placed, anywhere someone had trusted the system enough to let it in. And they used it, not for safety, not for emergencies, for enforcement. They watched and then they fined. When that realization spread through the neighborhood, disbelief came first. It was too invasive, too absurd to feel real at first. But disbelief doesn't last long when there's evidence. And there was evidence. The police became involved soon after. Once they were, things moved with a kind of quiet efficiency that didn't leave much room for denial. Subpoenas were issued. The vendor was brought in. Server logs were pulled and reviewed. What they found wasn't accidental. The HOA board had accessed private camera feeds repeatedly, often late at night, often for reasons that had nothing to do with security. They cross-referenced what they saw with violation notices. They built cases based on moments captured inside people's homes. One officer, after reviewing the logs, summed it up in a way that stuck. This isn't security. he said. This is surveillance. And even that wasn't the worst of it. Because buried in the data beneath the routine access logs and viewing records, there was something else. One board member stood out. His activity didn't match the others. He wasn't just viewing footage. He was saving it, downloading clips, capturing images, storing them. At first, investigators thought it might be for documentation, misguided, but still within the same pattern of overreach. That assumption didn't last long. They followed the trail. Accounts, transactions, messages, and the picture became clear. He wasn't just collecting images. He was selling them, private moments, taken from inside people's homes, distributed to strangers for money. People who had never consented, never even realized they were being watched, suddenly reduced to something tradable. Once that came to light, everything accelerated. Search warrants were executed. Devices were seized, phones, computers, storage drives, all of it taken and examined. The HOA tried to distance itself, tried to suggest this was an isolated issue, a single bad actor. But the logs didn't support that. The access itself had been authorized at the board level. The vendor had enabled it. The structure was built for it. What that board member did with the access was his own escalation. But the system that made it possible was not. By the time the case reached court, it had grown into something much larger than a dispute over fines or policy. It had become a question of privacy, of consent, of what happens when small authority is treated like absolute control. The courtroom was full. The courtroom was packed the day the evidence was presented. Not just with residents, but with reporters, because by then, the story had spread beyond the neighborhood. It wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It was something people paid attention to. The prosecutor didn't start with arguments. He started with a screen. Let's begin with a single access log, he said, pulling up a timestamp. Late evening. A private residence, then another. Early morning. Different home. Then a third. A garage interior. These, that he said calmly, are not public spaces. The defense tried to interrupt. Something about administrative permissions, about system misunderstanding, but the judge raised a hand. Sit, he said. The room went quiet again. The prosecutor continued. He matched timestamps to violation notices, showed how the board had issued fines within hours, sometimes minutes of accessing private footage. Then he shifted. Different set of records. Transactions. Amounts, dates, recipients. These, he said, are tied to the same login credentials. He clicked again. An image appeared on the screen. Not graphic, not shocking, just private. A moment inside someone's home that had no business being anywhere else. The silence in the room changed. The judge leaned forward slightly. Where did this come from? He asked. Exported from the HOA system, the prosecutor replied. Saved and distributed by the defendant. There was no coming back from that. The defense didn't try. The board was dissolved immediately. Charges followed for multiple members. Unauthorized surveillance, invasion of privacy, misuse of data. The one who sold the images faced far more serious consequences. And he did not leave the courtroom as a free man. The vendor lost everything tied to the system: contracts, licenses, reputation. His cooperation came too late to shield him from the fallout. The cameras came down soon after. Those that remained were stripped back to what they should have been from the beginning, limited to public spaces, tightly controlled, transparent in their use. The neighborhood changed after that. Not just because the cameras were gone, but because trust was. People closed their blinds a little more carefully. Conversations carried a little more weight. There was an understanding now, quiet, but shared, that something fundamental had been crossed. Because the problem was never the cameras, it was what someone decided to do with them. And once that line is crossed, it doesn't matter how quietly it happened. It leaves a mark that doesn't go away.